Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this monsoon-like weather evening. I'm Lisa Hostetler. I'm McAvoy Family Curator of Photography here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to tonight's panel, which is associated with the exhibition Landscapes in Passing, photographs by Steve Fitch, Robbert Flick, and Elaine Mayes. It's on the second floor, and if you go to the F Street side of the museum and go up to the second floor, that's where you can find the exhibition. The way tonight will work is each artist will give a short slideshow about their work that will include work from, well, it'll include whatever work they want to talk about. But so it'll be works from the show, but also other kinds of work. I thought I would, before we got to that part, I'll give you a little bit of background about the genesis of the exhibition. And then after the presentations, we'll sit up here for a discussion. I'll start us off with a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience to take your questions. So planning for this exhibition began shortly after I arrived here in September of 2012. In reviewing the collection, I noticed that we had these three bodies of work that all looked at the American landscape from the road. And the fact that they were all made between 1971 and 1980 struck me as particularly intriguing, given the changes taking place in contemporary photography during that decade, and particularly in American landscape photography. And in the history of photography, this period is often sort of absorbed into the new topographics. And when I looked at these three bodies of work, I realized that they were really doing something very different from the new topographics, related, but had their own perspective on what was going on. So like the new topographics photographers, they updated our view of the American landscape from a sort of transcendental, majestic wilderness to something that was traversed and a bit more prosaic. But unlike them, they seem to emphasize not so much the effect of human development on America's natural resources, but the fact that the relationship between humans and their environment was sort of changing fundamentally. And it was informed by the fact that by the 1970s, Americans' understanding of their country was increasingly taken over by automobile travel. So from family road trips on recently constructed interstates to daily commutes from and to the suburbs, not to mention just simple drives through the countryside, people were becoming conditioned to experience place purely visually and while in transit. So these artists' work acknowledged that situation in a range of ways, and their observations continue to ring true. In fact, our connection to our surroundings has become perhaps even more mediated over the past 40 years, not just by the networks of roads and the edges of our car window, but also by modern technology, from satellite imagery and Google Earth to Tumblr and Flickr and a million other devices. Given contemporary discussions about fossil fuels, global mobility, and the currency of photographic imagery, I thought this would be a good time to bring their work forward again and consider the ideas that are embedded within it. You'll notice that so far I haven't talked about or tried to interpret the individual series that are in the exhibition, and that's because I know that this is best done by the artists themselves. So I'll step back and let them take over now. I'll just come back in between each presentation and give you a little background about the artist. So our first speaker is Elaine Mayes, who created the 1971 series Auto Landscapes, selections from which are in the exhibition. Born in Berkeley, California, Mayes received her BA from Stanford University and went on to study with Minor White at the California School of Fine Arts, which is now the San Francisco Art Institute. She's taught at a number of institutions, including Hampshire College and New York University, where she was chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging from 1996 to 2001. Currently, she's professor emerita at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts and lives in upstate New York. Her work's been exhibited widely, and her books include When I Dance, It Happened in Monterey, and Ki'i no Hawaii, photographs of, from, about Hawaii. Please join me in welcoming Elaine Mayes.
Now, I'm supposed to run this, or how is this working?
Just,
Advance it.
yes.
Now it'll be timed.
Right.
Okay. That's quick. Let's move on. I thought I'd give you a couple title cards to mention sort of overall things that I wanted to anticipate questions that you might ask. But one thing about this that I'm just going to say is that my photography generally accompanies my life. It's part of what I do when I'm in the world. It's not a separate thing. And these pictures happened because I was moving, as the card said, from Massachusetts to New York. I had an NEA grant. I was in a car that was full of stuff, including 4 cats, and all my worldly belongings on the way to my job at Hampshire College, which was a brand new school, and I went there to be on the founding faculty. And so I started taking pictures out the window, and I thought of several things as I was doing this. And so the project grew as I was traveling along. And I became very interested in the horizontal aspect of what happens when you look out the side of the car. So in editing, these all ended up pretty much being pictures out the side window because of the sort of formal concerns that were in all art at those times. I was affected by that. So and then there were a few that didn't make the edit that aren't in the show, like that one, or this one that in fact is in the show, this picture is kind of a miracle. Because I took it at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to just go back a little bit. I was driving the car, and I went like this, and it was a miracle. That's all you can say. So the gift of being in the right place at the right time is something I've always trusted. And people think that I staged this picture. It's not true. This was in Utah. It was so funny that I couldn't resist. So it's not out the side window, it's out the front window, and you can tell by each picture whether I was driving or not if you really think about it. Sometimes I was, sometimes I wasn't. And that one was at the top of Independence Pass in Colorado. And this one, as the title card says, was the next day or the next morning in Denver. And then I went through Nebraska and continued this process of looking out the side window. And it is the idea of photographing when the landscape changes, but it's also whatever I see that looks interesting, which is maybe the same thing, but it's not arbitrary, it's completely specific. This one was a killer moment. It's another time where it was 6 o'clock in the morning, the sun was coming up, and I'll go back a little bit on that one. And I said, oh my God. And so in this case, I think I probably was driving. But if you imagine me in the driver's seat, probably true. Can't really remember. This one is not in the exhibit, but now when I go through them again, I look at them and I think there are more dimensions to this than my early 70s conceptual notion. So in this presentation, I'm mixing them up a little bit. And I always tried to get pictures of people in their cars, and they felt so invaded. It's so amazing. They still do. So the idea in editing was to sort of do a sequence of the trip across the country. So now we're in Indiana, and we just kept going. That's all the way in Hartford, Connecticut. That's a factory that manufactures guns. Then closer to home, this was taken in Massachusetts, on a smaller road, getting closer to where I was going. And this one I took, we parked the car. It wasn't our car that was broken down, but I thought it was sort of symbolically interesting. Okay, then 40 years later, I made the same trip, not following exactly the same path, but certainly driving across the country, again moving from west to east. And I began to take pictures again. This trip was interesting in a different way. I had cataracts. I couldn't see very well. I broke my glasses, so my partner Randy did all the driving. So they're all taken from the passenger seat. And I abandoned my out the side window idea, and I looked in any direction that I saw something that was interesting. Although a lot of them repeated that same notion of looking out the side window. And another thing I'll mention with both these series, I was trying desperately to make pictures that felt still, that you didn't know you were moving. And it was my game with photography and how you frame things to try to make compositions and to make something stopped that was going 70 miles an hour or some rapid speed. And the second trip, I focused more on roadside attractions because the interstates had grown up, and when I went across the first time, there was nothing there. And then this one, of course, everybody who's driven across the country knows that there are wall drugstore signs for 200 miles, and you see many of them. On this particular trip, it rained, and it rained, and it rained a lot, so there are a lot of pictures in the rain. This one's Minnesota. And you can see the drops on the window. Actually, that was South Dakota. I take it back. So is this one. So because I wasn't driving and because it was a practiced kind of thing, I felt much freer about photographing anything that appealed to me. But the weather was really spectacular on this trip. It was magnificent. I'm not sure what else to say about them. I used color because I switched to digital, and why not just take pictures in color and see if you like them. I was very excited about all the windmills in Iowa and Minnesota. Iowa's just covered with windmills now. So anything I saw that pertained to the experience of being in a car and what you see out the window was what I focused on. This is one of the propellers on one of those huge windmills. It's, 100 feet across. I might be exaggerating here. Very, very big. So this trip was essentially the same thing, but more loosely seen and with less of a concept. That's in Iowa also. You see the sign, so is that. And I don't know what else to say about it, but another part of doing this is dealing with the boredom of riding in a car. So if I'm a passenger, what am I going to do for 6 or 7 hours? Well, why not take pictures? And more people from the window, out the side. And I liked that one a lot. And I liked the idea of the roadside attractions. You get billboards for them and so on, which I would have done the first time, but they weren't there. So I noticed that the culture moved closer to the road. There's a town every 50 miles with a chain hotel for you to stay in. And the road is dominated by trucks, not by cars. People don't drive across the country anymore, they fly. And also motel rooms, restaurants, Denny's, where you stop for coffee every afternoon. And then it rained again. That's in Pennsylvania. So it was a very different kind of a trip, but in a way the same idea that photographing out the window of a car is a position we all have experience with. And that's what our American experience is riding around in a car. That's it.
Our next speaker is Steve Fitch, whose photographs from the series Diesels and Dinosaurs are in the second gallery of the exhibition. He made those works between 1971, the year he graduated from the University of California at Berkeley with a degree in anthropology, and 1976, when the Diesels and Dinosaurs book was published. He earned a master's degree from the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque in 1978 and taught at the University of Colorado in Boulder beginning in 1981. From 1986 to 1990, he taught in the visual arts program at Princeton University. Books of his work, in addition to Diesels and Dinosaurs, include Marks in Place, Contemporary Responses to Rock Art, published in 1988, and Gone, Photographs of Abandonment on the High Plains, published in 2003 to accompany a traveling exhibition of the same name organized by the New Mexico Museum of Art. Currently, he's based in Santa Fe, where he's taught photography at the College of Santa Fe since 1990, and where he lives in a passive solar adobe house. Please help me greet Steve Fitch.
Where's the changer? Thank you. Thank you. Let's see, it's this one? No, that's the...
Aim it at the...
There we go. Yeah, I had graduated from the University of California in Berkeley in 1971, and I had this notion in my head I wanted to travel, explore the country, and make pictures about the highway, although I wasn't really sure what that meant. You know, I think like any creative project, when you start, you don't know really where it's going. One of the very first pictures I made, I'd start taking these 2 or 3 week trips. I was living in Berkeley, and I'd come back with pictures, develop the film, make prints. And this was one of the first ones I made on the way to the Grand Canyon. And, you know, I sort of thought that was directed at me. You know, I took it personally. To get film, hit the rim loaded, and take pictures. So I started making pictures of signs, billboards, truck stops, roadside attractions. You know, I really liked the lettering in this. The film is really well made letters. Hit the rim loaded is sort of these speed letters. And then by the time the sign painter got to 8 miles on the left, sort of running out of gas, abbreviating left. A roadside attraction in Oklahoma, a snake pit. You know, I have to explain to my kids what a snake pit was, but they used to exist along the highway. I really liked the way this guy, he ran a snake pit, but he was irritated that everybody was asking if he had dinosaurs. You know, he had cobras, rattlesnakes, 2-headed lizards, but no dinosaur. So he got a car hood, painted that sign, and this is a cobra made out of stovepipes. So I thought this really captured some kind of absurdity about America in a way, partly resourcefulness. You need a sign, get a car hood, paint a sign. But something also kind of crazy. So I kept making these trips, and gradually I think the idea of what I was working on or what it meant to me became clearer. You know, I realized that I was interested in roadside attractions. I was interested in stuff along the highway. I also started to realize that I was particularly paying attention to the 2-lane highway. You know, like Elaine was talking about interstates. You know, the interstates really start being built and still getting finished. They weren't all done. And I was more interested in the 2-lane roads, especially the 2-lane roads that were what the interstates were replacing, the cross-country 2-lane roads. This was in Vernal, Utah, a dinosaur rampaging through town. I started on one trip in 1972. You know, I would come back, develop my film, make prints, sort of look at what I'm doing, engage the feedback loop. And at one point I realized that I was missing something about the highway that I was interested in. And it had to do with night. You know, a lot of the energy of work traveling on the highway had to do with driving at night, listening to funky radio stations. And out west, you know, coming into towns where there'd be these great neon signs, neon lit motels. So on one trip, I made a number of night pictures, not really knowing whether I could even do it. I didn't know how exposures would work. but I liked a lot of the night pictures. So gradually, I did more and more work at dusk and at night. I noticed, to me there were these great monuments sort of along the highway, which were the drive-in movie theaters. And I made pictures of a number of the drive-ins, a lot of great ones in Texas. This was in Dallas. This was actually the first night picture I made. I shot 18 exposures. I was using 2¼ film, bracketing, because I didn't know what the correct exposure was going to be. And I went all the way from like 1 second to about, 12 minutes. Turns out the second or third exposure was really good, and it was this one. And I love this picture with a clock that shows me what time I took the picture, at 14 minutes to 9. And you can't see it in the slide very well, but there's a second hand that's blurred for about a half a second. I really like that, a photograph of a clock that it's telling me the time I took the picture and how long the exposure was. And you'll see another clock picture in a later series I did. I've always been fascinated with pictures, photographs with clocks. This was Deadwood, South Dakota, by the way. Along Route 66, Oklahoma, time to rest. There used to be a number of those kinds of clocks. Time to gas, time to eat, time to rest. There was one that I don't have a picture of, but There Is Still Time, which was on a church. Yeah, time to rest. I like this picture. The way the scale's ambiguous, you're not sure how big things are. On the one hand, it looks like that building could be huge, but anyway, those pictures in 1976 were published in the book Diesels and Dinosaurs, and like I said, I thought what I was working on was sort of an homage to the two-lane highway, a changing landscape that was sort of being replaced by the interstate. But by the time I published the book and when I put the pictures together, in Diesels and Dinosaurs, there's a sequence. I was influenced by Robert Frank's book, The Americans, the idea of a sequence in a book. And at that point, when I was putting the sequence together, it really sort of dawned on me that the pictures were kind of an homage to childhood trips my family would take when we would go from where I grew up in Northern California to the family farm in South Dakota where all my cousins and uncles lived. And these trips we took as a family, the actual trip of getting someplace was as important as actually getting there, which I sort of think of as the journey. My family, we would stop at all these roadside attractions, and we would stay in these neon-lit motels, and we'd take 2 weeks to get back to South Dakota. So while I was making the pictures, I wasn't really that aware of what I was doing, but by the time the book was done, I realized this was sort of a childhood vision of a road trip. And there's a lot of talk about road trips these days. And I've thought about road trips, and I think there's different kinds of road trips. There's the Jack Kerouac, on the road, back and forth. There's the 1930s road trip, which was more one of people moving from a place where their life wasn't working out to some place where they hoped it would. There are photographic road trips, the childhood road trip like of mine. And I was just reading the other day about the road trip Harry Truman took right after he was no longer president of the United States. He and Bess took a road trip from Independence, Missouri to Washington, which is amazing. Imagine a president today no longer being president and getting in a car with his wife and taking a road trip without Secret Service, So, there are all these different kinds of road trips, I think. And anyway, I continued to make pictures of sort of the same subject matter, signs, roadside attractions. I started working with an 8x10 view camera and in color. This is 1981, Nebraska. That's a train moving by in the background that's blurred. And I really like that Aero modern like it's pointing to modern sitting over here on the side. But there's also camping at this motel. Albuquerque, New Mexico. The neon that's lit right above a door that's closed in. Part of what I think is interesting to me about photography is that I'm pointing at things that interest me. And I think part of photography for me is a pointing out. And that's what I would say about this. I'm pointing out this motel that I found interesting. And I intersected this motel right at this one moment in time where part of the neon was burned out, where the door had been covered over. I later went by a year or two later, and it's totally different. And I've always been interested in that idea of intersecting a subject matter where it's changing and I'm changing, and we sort of are these two arcs that come together or connect. Espanola in New Mexico. Most of the pictures I'm showing you now, and the ones I'm going to show you, a few more, these things don't exist anymore. This was when, again, it was the two-lane highway, pre-franchise, so that there were all these mom and pop signs, motels. You didn't stay in a Holiday Inn and drive all day and stay in another Holiday Inn. So this was a kind of mom and pop motel that actually is still there in Espanola, New Mexico. It's talking about the idea of these road trips. To me, what a trip was on a two-lane highway, like the Jack Kerouac on the road, those kinds of trips. Like I said earlier, there was a journey. To get from one place to another, you had to travel through space and time. I think the interstates, and especially jet travel, have eliminated that. We get on a plane and fly for 4 hours, and we're 2,000 miles away. There's almost no journey anymore. It's more like an amusement park ride. You're nervous before you get on the plane. It happens just like that, and then you're smiling when you get off and people meet you. Same with the interstates. The journey's not exactly been eliminated, but you get on the interstate, you stay in a motel, you drive 600 miles, you stay in the exact same motel. Different experience. For 35 years, I've been with a 2.25 camera, just making color sort of documents, pictures of a lot of these, individual signs, which to me are like these little roadside sculptures. And one thing digital technology and Photoshop and all that has allowed people to do, myself included, is it's real easy to assemble pictures. So I've been kind of an archaeologist in my own work lately, where I go through this whole inventory of negatives, I scan them, and I can put them together in groups and just print them as one print, which is what that is. And these are the last ones I'm going to show. A project I worked on from 1990 to 2000, again, involved exploring, it involved traveling, and in this case, it was all up and down the high plains, from western North Dakota, eastern Montana, down to New Mexico, Texas. The high plains were really interesting to me. I'd crossed them for many years, always noticed all these abandoned buildings. One trip I took in 1991, I started to go inside some of these buildings. This was the very first picture I made inside an abandoned honky-tonk. And I just go, wow, this is great. And I was using an 8x10 camera. And I started another honky-tonk, started making all these interior photographs. They were kind of like making night pictures. They were long exposures. The light was doing interesting things. And I started realizing that this whole abandonment that I was photographing on the high plains was really an interesting phenomena, that the high plains had been settled, the homesteaders started settling there in the 1880s. But almost from the moment, I like the way the light's pushing that door open, by the way. It's almost like the light's a physical force pushing its way in. Ever since they started getting settled, they started getting abandoned. And the high plains to this day are still being abandoned. People are leaving. And in fact, Frederick Turner, the historian in 1890, said the frontier is now closed because we have more than 2 people per square mile in the West. Well, there's 150 or 160, 180 counties in the high plains today where the population is less than 2 people per square mile. So I call it the rear tier. We're going back to. Another thing I love about photography, I consider this almost to be a found setup. I didn't set it up, I found it, but it sort of is like my setup. Only I could have never thought to put deer antlers as an antenna on a TV. Clocks, I've found buildings. This is in North Dakota, out on the plains, western North Dakota. I'd find these clocks, and in the book, these are published in a book called Gone, and there's several clocks in there. This one's not, but some of them are plugged in, but of course there's no electricity there anymore. And I kind of felt like this was a revisiting some icon or part of my past, the idea of a clock in a photograph. Again, the idea to me of a photograph being sort of a setup, meaning I didn't set anything up other than the way I guess composed it or photographed it. But I love the relationship between the details. The kid's doll head on the couch, Santa, the carpet, drawings. And that's in New Mexico. And that's it.
Thanks, Steve. Our third artist is Robbert Flick. Photographs from his series Sequential Views, made in 1980 as part of the Los Angeles Documentary Survey Project, populate the final gallery of the exhibition. He was born in the Netherlands and lived first in the Dutch West Indies and then Vancouver before he moved to Los Angeles in 1968 to attend graduate school at UCLA, where he studied with Robert Heineken. From 1971 to 1976, he taught at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and then he returned to Los Angeles in 1976 to teach at the University of Southern California, where he continues to be professor of fine arts at the Roski School of Fine Arts. His work's been exhibited widely, including in a 2004-2005 retrospective at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, which published an accompanying catalog titled Trajectories, the photographic work of Robbert Flick. Please join me in welcoming Robbert Flick.
Thank you, Lisa. I may need this because I expect to have my throat respond negatively to reading. But I will read to you because I want to be precise. And so photography has always been and continues to be a journey for me. It functions as a way to explore, come to terms with, and articulate my encounters with the world. At the very start, there was a visceral embrace, a necessity to render my surroundings, taking advantage of the mimetic capabilities of the camera. This was followed very quickly with a search for mastery to satisfy yet another need, the wish to emulate, which led to repeat dissatisfactions, since what was rendered did not come close to the articulation of perceived experience. During the 60s, work became less about framing and more about acknowledging a moment, the layering of experiences and the conjunction of chance occurrences, such as this conjunction of multiple exposures while traveling the Los Angeles freeways and visiting Disneyland. It is part of a group of images I now shelter under the title LA Diary. The remarkable thing about a diary is that while it consists of personally relevant entries, some segments can take on an independent existence, much like the characters in a novel who may escape the writer's intentions and take on an independent journey. I moved to the Midwest and suffered culture shock. From the air, I'd seen the imposed grid on the organic landscape. Driving endlessly through these fields, I began to think of them as earthworks. I became interested in the relationship of locus and horizon line. I also realized that the repetition and distribution of anonymous parts in the vernacular landscape shaped its sense of place. In emphasizing the vernacular, I unknowingly participated in a photographic paradigmatic shift that was occurring at the time. The contact sheets from the Midwest Diary became a map for the unfolding territories of attention, maps that contained within them the eventual sequential views. What we're looking at here is sequential 14, Manhattan Beach looking west from Vista, which in 100 frames traces a series of parallel streets. What binds the images together is the fact that each one of the frames is looking in the same direction and that there appears to be a consistent relationship to the horizon line across the frames. So as you're looking here, you start to see a continuity, a suggested continuity. What really happened is that there is a consecutive taking of parallel streets, and we'll look at that in a little bit more. And in addition, and this may be less obvious, there's also a direct relationship between the vertical frames. This street here, we can follow all the way down to the beach and there. There's a parallel street over here, but that is blocked. This view here, in the distance is this, and then the view is blocked. The red dots that you're looking at here represent the locations from which the previous images were taken. So the photographs are bound to verifiable map locations. The way this piece was shot was simply from a high range here, where a photograph was taken at every intersection, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Here's a small detail from the 100 photographs that constitute this sequential view. In the center is the uninterrupted view down a street looking towards the ocean. And on the right and left are interrupted views. Each frame is a carefully constructed moment where I have a conversation not only with the site, but also with photographic history and its practitioners. As always in photography, there is the element of chance. I really didn't know that the bikini-clad lady in the top left was being offered a bouquet of flowers when I made the exposure. The sequential view is a performance. To take the photographs for this one took approximately 4 hours. Once the decision has been made to proceed, there is no stopping in the process of encounter with the changing present along a predetermined route. What to include, what to exclude, how to differentiate a busy street from a quiet one, how the overall gridded set of images may become a singularity, how detail and overview coalesce into vista, all orchestrated by map coordinates. Well, in the city, the reference points are a basic given with street names and addresses. There are no coordinates when moving through the natural landscape. I should point out that this work dates back from well before the time that accurate GPS was economically accessible. To photograph in an environment without markers now became the acknowledging of perceived shifts in perception of space and place as rendered by the camera when moving along a trajectory from A to B, such as here, where the top left image is the chosen goal for a journey across an unknown landscape. Each frame an acknowledgement of a shifting set of relations. The individual frames eventually coalescing into a conglomerate structure resembling an aerial view of the desert. The source for this way of thinking about photographing and representation has its roots in my chronologically preceding Arena series, where for 2.5 years I sought to trace the shifting processes of perception against the unchanging, brutal functionality of an empty parking structure. Working there provided an opportunity to explore the inherent contradictions and illusions of the photographic image. There's an irony attached to photographing a parking structure without cars and seeking possible meanings. Meanings which in part have their source in the gas crisis of the late 70s, but also within larger economic conditions of Los Angeles. So when asked to participate in the photographic documentation of Los Angeles, using the simulation of car and driver's view became a working method. Sadly, I had to wait 10 years until the arrival of digital technology and video capture before I could really address what interested me in a visual narrative for Los Angeles. Video capture from a moving vehicle allowed the rendering of extended segments of the city. The careful selection of adjacent frames in sequence helped visual structures to come into being, which for the viewer might echo the perceived experience of place and time. The imagery followed the Eurocentric logic of display, left to right, top to bottom, much like reading a text. The encounter, however, was pictorial. The viewer could enter anywhere in the visual field and construct a set of private meanings. In a way, each frame became a brushstroke in a larger field. Collectively, the frames spoke to the existence of historical and temporal processes, and at times made visible what was inaccessible in a singular image, like the flow of traffic controlled by the variations of duration in traffic lights, or the presence or absence of foliage in different economic sectors. The LA Document series, of which Pico B and C, which we just saw, are a part, were initially printed as large-scale cibachromes, meant to be viewed from varying distances. This is an installation view of the work at the Los Angeles County Museum for the Trajectories exhibit. Scale continues to be an important component of the work. It allows the detailed content to be read and considered within multiple contexts. The at camera installation, also at LACMA, consists of 3 40 by 64-inch ilfochrome prints derived from frame captures of a 45-minute high-8 video. Even though the prints, when encountered, read like an expansive scanning view of the ocean, the imagery was obtained from a fixed position. Only the ocean moved. Carefully excluding horizon line and framing a fixed segment of the ocean allowed for the tracing of the temporal unfolding of what occurred in front of the camera. In this segment, from one of the pieces, parallel rows show the unfolding and shaping of different waves. This is only a very small segment of one of the 3 large pieces, where in each one, 30 rows of 40 adjacent frames combine for a total of 1,200 frames each. Most of what I do is based on the rendition of the appearance of physical reality into a composite poetic whole. I view this as a meditation on time, not times past, but rather the rendering of passages of time in different spatial configurations. Over the last 10 years, I have been intensely focused on the photography of the urban landscape while traveling by car or train during my commute between Claremont and downtown Los Angeles. The resulting record traces not only shifts in patterns of development, but also addresses questions of layered display and temporal simultaneities when observer and observed move at different rates in relation to one another and generate patterns of uncertainty. My current work continues the investigation of temporal phenomena, taking advantage of new technical developments as they become available. Questions and meanings shift with the arrival of new tools. The tiny video frame of only a few years ago now becomes an 8 by 10-inch image of remarkable resolution. These 8 by 10-inch frames, when placed within the context of almost simultaneously occurring other frames, generate a visual staccato across a field that offer, to my mind, a reflection on the culture of contemporary experience. Thank you. Are we moving? Okay.
Doing this? We'll start the panel.
Okay. We can take that one down.
Oh, okay. Thank you again for coming and for your presentations, which were wonderful. I wanted to start with a really basic question. And when I was researching the show, I started to think about road trips in general, and Steve mentioned some of those, but Jack Kerouac on the Road, Robert Frank's The Americans, Easy Rider came out in '69 and sort of unleashed a whole slew of road movies. And then, of course, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas came out in the early '70s. But all of these kinds of products, cultural products, had sort of a rebellious, countercultural sort of theme to them. And it seemed to me that what you were working on was the road trip as sort of a rite of passage in American life. And so what I'm wondering is, what was your opinions about car culture at the time versus how you feel about it now, and sort of what changed your mind and how were you thinking at the time and versus now?
Which one of us are you asking?
Any and all of you.
I take the train.
Well, yeah, mine I don't think was rebellious. It wasn't exactly Easy Rider, and I was already working on Diesels and Dinosaurs pictures when some of those things, like Fear and Loathing, came out. You know, I don't think it was counterculture, but on the other hand, I did go to Berkeley from 1967 to 71, and was there during People's Park and the anti-war riots, and was very much a kind of counterculture type person, to the extent that I built my own house out in the middle of nowhere more recently. So that had to have been infecting me, and I loved On the Road. But now looking at it, and I think when I was doing the pictures, like I said, they ended up being more, you know, kind of about my childhood, and I don't think there was anything rebellious. It was almost more of an embrace or an homage, and it really was more about the notion of a journey, I think. Road trip is a journey, which you move through time and space. And in the case of the road trip I made as a kid, and I was doing in Diesel and Dinosaurs, it involved roadside attractions and stopping. And, you know, Jack Kerouac on the road was movement, you know, and not a lot of stopping. So it was different. So like I had said, I think there's different kinds of road trips. And yeah, mine was not rebellious. I don't think.
I'd like to mention, when I was at the Art Institute or California School of Fine Arts, I came in one day with pictures that I'd taken out the car window, and I was told you're not allowed to do that. You have to stop the car and get out and really know the place. So I didn't take them for a long time. But my motivation, I think, is complicated. It's personal and it's also observational, is that we took road trips all the time when I was a kid. We were always camping in weird places where you weren't supposed to be. We always had horrible sleeping bags left over from World War II that shed feathers, made me sneeze. But my father liked to drive 600 miles a day minimum. So I feel like I grew up on the road. And when these pictures started in the 70s, I knew I had this grant and I was supposed to photograph the landscape, but it had nothing to do with the road in terms of what I proposed. But I got a job and I had to be on the road, and I said, okay, I guess this is where the landscape is. But in general, I've always been an observer of culture, absolutely fascinated by popular culture. I grew up in California primarily. The giant orange phenomenon I remember really clearly, and wanting to stop there and get a chocolate milkshake because they had those too. So I feel like I've been on the road my whole life, and I think taking pictures from the car certainly was a rebellious response, no question.
Neither for me. The trip or the road trips were not really the road trips that you both did. It was for the most part, you know, traveling 90 miles per hour on the freeways in Los Angeles, which you could do at that time. And what happens at that point is that you're getting to see and flow with things in a way that is you're not capable to freeze. In other words, you're acknowledging something, which is why I was responding to, you know, the way in which those early 70s pictures of you functioned, because they read so very much like a gesture to a bringing together of all the parts of endlessly driving down that damn landscape, and then picking up something and then going, chip, and there it is. And so it's that notion of the photograph as an acknowledgement rather than the photograph as a frame that was coming out of that way of working
Yeah.
at 90 miles per hour.
Yeah. I didn't mention that the digital technology affected my second pictures, because with a digital camera, you can photograph at a very fast shutter speed, whereas earlier, 500th was maximum. I had one camera that I could shoot at 1,000th of a second, but it never was that fast. So the blur was just part of the medium, and there was no way you could get around it. Now, in the last trip, I realized I could point the camera that way, and I could stop it, because it would, at f4, it would be, I don't know, a really
10,000.
fast shutter speed, and it was automatic. You just point the camera and you'd get it. So it changed the look of the pictures a great deal, not only the color, but also the way the cameras worked.
Going back to what you were saying about, being told that you had to stop the car in order to take a picture, how did you see your work in relation to other landscape photography at the time, or did you know other landscape photography? I mean, I'm sure you knew historical examples, but it's not as it is now, where sort of you can find out about anybody's work in the art world on the internet. So how did you see yourself fitting into that?
I never thought about it. I mean, that's the truth. I mean, I did spend later, in 1977, I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning and took my tripod and my Leica out in the misty landscape of the Northeast to make pictures, because it was misty and because I liked that light at that time of day as the sun was coming up. And so that was my competition with Ansel Adams, I said, because I had the camera on the tripod, and I was composing very carefully and spending a long time, and I was doing it in 35 millimeter, which you weren't supposed to do either. I mean, why put a 35 millimeter camera on a tripod? So it was like sort of it was the same attitude with the wrong equipment, except I like grain. So I don't know. I always looked at other photographs. I always thought my job was to take my pictures and not somebody else's. So I was well aware of everybody else's pictures, but I really didn't think about it. I just thought about what I wanted to do.
Yeah, I don't think I ever considered myself a landscape photographer.
Okay.
Landscape photographers, Ansel Adams photographed nature. My pictures, the diesels and dinosaurs ones, really came more out of folklore. I had a professor at Berkeley, Alan Dundes, who was a folklorist, and he collected oral folklore, and I was very influenced by that idea. And I think I was thinking more that I was using photography in a way to collect folklore. And that's something I really like about photography, actually. And that one of mine, the 12 motel signs, I like how photography can collect and compare. You can take pictures of these signs scattered all over the landscape, put them together at a form where you can see the relationships. When the new topographics came out in 1974, that actually changed my thinking. That was landscape photography that I could relate to, in a way. Although it was different than what I was doing, mine was more absurd. Those were, cooler, but by cooler I mean
Conceptual.
more
deadpan.
It was just different, but I really liked them and I could relate to it, and that changed my thinking about landscape photography. And I think a lot of people, of my pictures, it's the inside the abandoned buildings. Actually, I consider those to be my most landscape photographs, because they're all about a landscape, which is the high plains, which was a landscape where people tried to homestead and farm, couldn't do it, and had to abandon. Those pictures are all about that landscape, even though you don't see the landscape in them. I consider them landscape photographs, actually.
Interesting.
There are two responses. One is that in terms of the new topographics, I think what happened was that way of being totally dissatisfied with how things were done was being picked up by a lot of practitioners who didn't know each other. I mean, all of a sudden, a large number of people were all, like you said, it's not quite what I'm doing, but this I can feed from. There's something that I can build from. On another level, in terms of Ansel Adams, you have to get out of the car to take the picture. I was very impressed with Weston and all of that, and the gorgeousness of his pictures, and they were like 17th century metaphysical statements of some kind. But then finding myself being driven up the coast to Monterey Park and having a 35mm camera in my hand with 24-75 film in it, and having to say, well, F Weston, And so there was this, but it was not in a negative sort of way. It was just an acknowledgement that, hey, we're in a different place, we're in a different time. These are different questions.
And I mean, there's been a lot, I think, well, especially in the new topographics, there was sort of a realization that, this Western landscape that we had sort of revered and viewed in this mystical fashion was being developed, and the topography was changing because of humans' effect on the landscape. And so, and that sort of image of, I think our image of the American landscape can affect how we treat actual nature. And I wondered about if you thought and saw a change in that from the time where you were working and until now.
You mean has art?
A change in what?
And the way that we treat the landscape.
We're less aware of it. I'm pretty sure that's true. We're too busy with everything else, even if we're hurling through space.
Right.
I hope we're not texting, but that's even one more removal.
I actually disagree with that. I think that, especially seeing the students, that there is an extreme awareness of what we're doing to our environment, and extreme awareness whereby people want to do something about it while they're reaching for whatever it is that they reach for. But there is an undercurrent that is really beginning to address it. Whether there is actually an ability to do something about it is another thing. And when I'm thinking about the publication of books over the last, say, 15, 20 years, all of which have addressed cultural issues and environmental issues. So there is something happening. But I don't think that it's necessarily changing. Is it just making us aware of something? And now what has to happen is something else has to kick it into place and make action on it.
I was thinking more of experiential than the way the landscape is regarded. That we all ride around in our cars. So in other words, it just has more to do with how things are experienced than what I feel
There's
about
definitely a change in how we experience the landscape, not just in cars. It's the face-down generation. Everybody's looking at their iPhones. Walking on streets, everybody's looking at their iPhones. Students come out in my class and they're all on the iPhones. And I've noticed my students don't seem very interested in landscape photography, whether it's natural of the nature, quote unquote, or the man-made landscape. I find that they don't seem interested in the kind. They're not interested in new topographics landscapes. They're not interested in Ansel Adams. They don't seem interested in the landscape. I think their world, and I don't know if this is good or bad, and I don't want to be cynical, but it's being mediated by screens. And there is one, quote-unquote, landscape photographer, one who photographed nature in a pure form, who I think did have a real influence on our culture, and that was Elliot Porter. And that was because of the Sierra Club books. There was a conjunction of Elliot Porter's photography and the very small club called the Sierra Club, and they published those books, which had a big impact somehow on our culture, I think. The Sierra Club became this big, huge environmental organization. And that was the only example I could think of where I think what you were kind of asking about the question, has photography or art, not just photography, had some kind of influence on our culture? There's one example. And maybe the painters of the 1800s, like Bierstadt and those people, they seem to have had some kind of influence too. The Hudson River School.
I'm not sure what you mean by influence.
Well, with the Sierra Club, with Elliot Porter's, it made people much more appreciative of the natural landscape and wanting to protect it.
Too, perhaps?
Yeah, and wasn't
Yeah.
there, when
Yeah.
Elliot Porter's book first came out, among the photographic group, a very strong resistance to that kind of work.
Yes, too pretty.
Yeah, too nice. And so, but I agree with you that he did have an extraordinary effect on the Sierra Club, and what they were trying to do at Glen Canyon failed, but at least got something going.
Yep. I mean, I think Ansel Adams had an influence too,
Yeah.
in the same kind.
Yes, yes.
But Elliot Porter is the one that it really became, I think, because of those books and at the time. But Ansel Adams too.
Well, I think we have a vision of what we expect the landscape to be in our minds, and then we look at artists' work and we see, different things, see it through other people's eyes, and I think that we've become a culture where we're much more interested in looking at pictures of it than actually going and experiencing it. Before I open it up to the audience, I wanted to give you a chance to ask each other questions about your work or about anything else. And do you have anything to ask each other?
One of my questions, what else do you photograph? Or is this a major, major focus?
What's this?
The
The 8 by 10 work.
attractions, the
Well-
road kind of work.
I still photograph it,
No,
but
I meant, do you have other work that you do as well? Okay.
yeah. I like construction, and when I retire, I'm going to spend a lot of my time watching construction sites. I'm going to take a chair out, and I'm going to watch stuff get built. I photographed my wife and I building our house. Took us 6 years. That's one other thing I've done. I did several series of pictures that I didn't show. Right now I'm doing a series using digital camera. I call them horizontals, stitching together pictures. I can't even describe them. They still involve the vernacular. I think a theme all the way through my whole work has been an interest in, starting with Alan Dundee's what our culture does in terms of roadside attractions, a form of outsider art in a way. I love outsider art. Howard Finster and all the different people and the people that build Gardens of Eden. In fact, I'm doing that in my own land. I learned how to do neon, bend neon. So I make these neon pieces that I put on the place I live. Anytime I build a water tank, we collect rainwater to use in our house, and we're off the grid. So all my neon pieces are lit by solar energy, and they're mounted on water tanks. And the next project I want to do is build my own outdoor movie theater with a big neon mural in the back.
There you go.
To which my son, who's a filmmaker, says, "Dad, we've been hearing you say that for 25 years now. You better get to it." So I build. I've got neon artwork on my land.
Well, I think it's interesting when I was researching your biography that you had a degree in anthropology, because it does seem like you do sort of a visual anthropology of culture.
Yeah, definitely. I think I have an anthropological kind of take on American vernacular. But I do other things, but yet that has been a major interest, and it takes new forms of how I go about it. The photographs change, I guess. Yeah, I had a question for you, just I kind of, the digital technology, how is that changing what you're doing, like GPS? And there's some echo of your last work of Google, driving along the road.
Actually, Google is, I started doing that well before Google, but that's a whole other thing. The way Google functions, and if you were to use Google Earth to obtain information or to obtain images, it's a very different way from the way in which I think of myself as making use, even though there seems to be a superficial similarity in terms of the outcome. The kind of that's why I introduced the word conversation with the site. When I'm working on a site, it is limited by a particular duration. I'm photographing thousands of pictures right now out of a moving train. It's a 55-minute travel that I do twice a day for 3 to 6 times a week. And there's thousands and thousands of images that are coming out of there are beginning to provide a kind of construct that is very, very different from the way that you scan Google. You scan Google in terms of the encounters of whatever it is that you're looking for, and that's it, and then you frame it. Mm-hmm. Then you move the camera around a little bit, perhaps, but it is a very different experience. It's essentially a screen experience. What I'm talking about is a perceived experience, and that's very different. At least I like to think it is.
Thank you. I'd like to open up the floor to the audience now for questions. The only thing I ask is we are webcasting this, so if you can ask your questions at the microphone so that our virtual attendees can hear your question, that would be great. Do we have any questions?
You mentioned that the students nowadays are less interested in making landscape photographs. What are some of the topics that they're looking at investigating in photography?
In terms of the landscapes that they're doing, it's the landscapes that they are immediately familiar with and the landscapes that they want to escape. They also are very interested in going to specific places like Yosemite and doing HDR photography. There is a way in which they are beginning to look at the empty spaces that, since we're working in Los Angeles, they're addressing the issues of places that haven't been, were ruined during the riots and have never been built up. So there's an address to that kind of landscape. It is literally the environment that they're beginning to look now at, the environment that they're living in, and they're beginning to communicate that on iPhones and exchanging ideas about it. And so there's stuff going on that, and much of it at this point is below the surface. It's among the various Instagrams that are being shared, but it is going on, and the kind of outrageousness that needs to be worked with. How it is going to outer itself, I have absolutely no idea yet. But I'm just seeing it. Yeah.
I would say, sort of echoing on that, I think they're interested in photographing events in their own life. You know, so much of it's pictures being made out of just the flow and the living of their life. And part of that's, you know, I'm really seeing iPhones being used a lot more. And a lot more interest, not necessarily in making prints, but sharing, which I'm not sure where that's going to go. And I think it's mirrored by what's happening in photojournalism. You know, I recently read an article about how the Magnum photographers, you know, the group of them have gotten together and had discussions about how is cell phone photography affecting what they do for a living. In that so much of the news photography now that shows up in Time magazine and other places was taken by participants, for example, of the demonstrations in Egypt. And more of the images are coming from the participants of the events, not professional photojournalists taking pictures of it. So I guess I would say I see that happening with the students. It's like the photographs they kind of naturally are inclined to make are photographs of their life, and that they're sharing them, and they're putting them on Facebook, which is a whole thing. You know, I'm seeing it happen, but I'm not very familiar with it because I only went on Facebook about 3 weeks ago. I'm not a social media person, and I did share a photograph.
I'd like to comment further on that. I've been on Facebook for a long time with my students, and what I've observed, and I completely agree that it's about their own experiences, but that they don't really care about aesthetics in the same way, about the beauty of a picture. They care about sharing it and communicating with it, and I think that's a whole different approach. So they don't really care what the picture looks like exactly, the way I always cared. So formal and aesthetic concerns are not the major idea.
Although I think they're receptive to that if you bring it up.
Yeah.
and start talking about it and pointing it out, then I think they do start caring about that some.
I have some of those dialogues, but I think they care more about the fact that they're engaged in the process.
I do think that perhaps out of that comes an awareness of what is appropriate for that way of, how do you communicate that? So the kind of aesthetics that we might impose upon something because we know how to put a frame around something
Right.
gets dissolved
Yeah, the
and
frame
becomes
isn't
something.
there
Yeah, the
anymore.
frame's
It
not
becomes
there.
something
Frame's
else.
gone. Yes.
And so there is a new kind of aesthetic that comes out. And the fact that they can remove their images that don't work after there's been a discussion is another kind of aesthetic gesture that takes place. But again, I don't know what that is going to be like, what it's going to look like. It's alien to me, and I all of a sudden feel my gray beard when I look at all of this.
Well, it's funny because these works seem to be about moving through a landscape physically, and now what we're talking about is moving globally only visually and only
Right.
ephemerally.
Well, like we're talking about Google and the way that the street view is just continuous. I heard of one student, not mine, who, and I think there are a number of people doing this, they're all working off the internet.
Right.
They are mining the Google images and grabbing them, and some of them actually have made prints and are doing things, but part of it's they grab stuff and then they share it and send it out. And, but that is something I think the younger students are doing, is not even going out into the world to photograph like we did, we go out in the world. They're going into the internet and they're on screens. To me, a big question is what's going to happen to the idea of prints and the idea of versus screens. So much of our culture is being mediated by experience on a screen. And I get in an argument, I play devil's advocate with friends of mine who are my generation, and I go, nah, there aren't even going to be prints in exhibitions, not too much longer. And, no, there's always going to be prints. We always want to have prints. I don't know.
I sure do.
I do.
Just been standing there.
Oh, yes.
The local PBS station has been rerunning Ken Burns' National Park series this last week. And he also did a road trip series called Horatio's Drive. I was just wondering what the panelists thought about his use of both, the new words, the new photography in the series, but also his use of historic black and white photographs, not only in National Park and Horatio's Drive, but even from the Civil War, World War II, any of the other series, incorporating those still photographs in a documentary series like he has.
I feel like I should answer your question. I was his teacher. That his style of filmmaking comes from the Canadian Film Board, and films that were made using still photographs. There's a famous one called City of Gold, made by Arthur Lipsick, and that's about Alaska. And it was the first example that I know of people really using stills to make a film. The kinetoscoping he does on them was something we frowned upon. We never liked that.
But that is his signature in a way.
I know, well, it's been made his signature.
Yeah.
But yeah, the idea of taking historic material and using it to tell the story of an era is a fabulous idea. It's wonderful.
I think it's kind of a precursor to what I was saying a minute ago. Now, he was mining historical photographs and all these still photographs and shaping them into a movie form by panning and doing all this. Now, it's the internet images that are being mined, and I'm not sure what's going to come out of it, but it's kind of does that make sense? A precursor.
Well, he's finding objects that retell a story. And when we don't have the prints, as you were just talking about, what happens to that history and that memory and those artifacts, It's an interesting question. I think we're in an interesting time.
Have any of you seen the National Park series or Horatio's Drive and how he uses landscapes in those two series?
I saw the National Park ones several years ago. I haven't seen Horatio's drawing.
I haven't seen Horatio either.
I haven't either.
But it's Ken Burns, and it's a brand. And
That's right.
and as a brand, I think he's doing a terrific thing of providing access, regardless of whatever critical views you might want to bring to his choices and his methodology, and the fact that some of his methodology at this point has become an app for iPhone. You know, that there's something about that is also an indication just how important he is.
Although I did just see the Central Park 5 a week ago or so, and that didn't have his hallmark.
He's got
It
other,
didn't have,
he has other people working with him.
well, it was his
now.
daughter, I think. He wasn't using photographs, still photographs. He wasn't doing the voiceover.
No, he has a lot of other people that he's been working with and sponsoring to do films.
Like that one was his daughter, I think.
Yes, and then there was another one she made as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question that's, hope I'm not oversimplifying, but there's talk of landscape, which seems to be mostly about external world. What do students today, is there any emphasis on using art and photography as art that plays a role in personal transformation? In other words, their internal life. And can you relate that to any of this discussion about landscape?
Well, first of all, I haven't taught for 13 years, except in a couple of workshops. But I gather what you're talking about is the minor white idea of landscape, where the image gives you information about yourself, about the way you're perceiving things, and it's a dialogue with the world out there that gives you some sense of yourself, perhaps. And I think that, I don't think that's around, but maybe people disagree.
No, I agree with you. There's a way in which the slowing down process that is attached to the minor white way of seeing, in other words, an ambulatory process, is beginning to disappear. When whatever you do on foot, what you see then, that's there, and the awareness that comes out of it. You're off the grid, so you get a way of daily, in a sense, encountering things that is of a very different order than I who sit in a train and into a shuttle and get things. Many of the students that I have don't have that particular sensibility, if you want to call it that, or inclination. Some of them will want to get that, or have that inclination. When I'm teaching analog, all of a sudden the slowdown of the process and the fact that you have to delay gratification become part and parcel of what I think it is that you're trying to point to. There's something in the way of looking, in the contemplative way of looking, that is very difficult to access in the present day. But it can happen, and it does happen in the little clusters when people have this, brief moment of exchange. But it's of a different order. To get someone to sit still and close their eyes for 40 seconds before they open it in front of the black and white image on the easel, I can't pull that one off anymore.
Is that what you're asking?
Well,
Sort of like
what I'm
my...
getting at is, what's the role of poetry in photography today that you see?
Oh, it's constant. If you think of poetry in the way that you hear it in the various musics that the people do, there's constant awareness of poetry. But it's not necessarily the poetry that we assume poetry should have as a look. It's a little bit like the way in which modernism, in a sense, is reoccurring, but it is not reoccurring in the way that it was then. What I bring to it, or what is being brought to it, is something else. But there is how to say that? The poetry that's being written today, that everybody is writing songs. Everybody is doing all these amazing things, but it's not necessarily according to the canons that we grew up with. And it's these new canons that are coming out.
I guess I was talking about the visual poetry, the poetry that might be in photographic images. I'm not necessarily talking about literature or written poetry.
I think I know what you're asking, Dennis, and I think I indulge in that a lot. If I feel the image has a kind of poetry, whatever that might mean, then I respond to it, which has to do with feelings and how somehow that the image can mirror one's feelings about something. And I don't know what to say about that today, but I don't think people are focused on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure quite how to answer that because I'm not sure of what I think. But, I grew up with photography and the idea of the poetry and the visual image. And I think maybe culturally we go through different stages. And I think maybe what's happening right now is just this explosion of stuff happening with iPhones and making images and not sharing them. And maybe the poetry's not being it's kind of lost in the pile right now. But I would bet that out of it's going to come a new kind of understanding or approaching or thinking about or making images. The poetry's there. And it's going to be a new form the groundwork's being laid now. I think things are going so fast. The technology's changing so fast, and students keep getting the latest technology, and just so much is happening that maybe a kind of moratorium of stopping and looking at it and getting re-engaged with the notion of visual poetry would probably be good right now for it to happen.
You have to slow down maybe to have a lot of poetry.
I teach a large format class this semester, and I'm like a dinosaur using view cameras. And and my whole point in talking about view cameras the very first day is you work very slow. It's not spontaneous. It's on a tripod. The image is upside down, and you carefully look at everything. And so the whole notion of slow down and pay attention to what you're doing. And I do think they like that because it's so different than what's happening in their world where there's just this explosion happening.
I'll just say one more thing about it. The ability to focus and pay attention has been written about as a faculty, and it's also been written about as a faculty that we're losing. And I sort of subscribe to that notion. Whether that's good or bad is another question, but it changes everything. It's the whole way people perceive and what they're thinking about is in a different place than what's been familiar to me my whole life. So I don't know what the new poetry is. I don't know if you can do poetry on the run. Maybe.
I think they do. I really do. I really think that that when you're saying there's something is coming, and it is coming, and it has to do with not only just the images, but it has to do with time-based images, it has to do with sound, it has to do with the collision and the bringing together of all these parts, and out of that is the new shape of things that I think.
Yeah, I just don't think we see it yet. We can't see it, or at least me being my generation, I can't see it. But I see things happening. One thing with the cell phone is you can shoot video, you can shoot still photographs, you can record sound, and you can share it. And so people do all of that. You're not a still photographer or a video photographer or a sound artist. They just do it all and mix. It's all mixed in there.
And think back to when we started, the way the camera became all of a sudden part of your clothing. It was part of the totality of it, and at the same time, Bob Dylan was singing his song about, you don't know what's happening or something like that. And so there is this involvement, an intensity of involvement that I think has an energy that is positive and that is shaping things, but that has to find its own form. And what that will be, I hope it will find its own form before it gets branded. But it may well get branded before you know it. And that's the scary thing for me.
Yeah, it's like I can just make observations is what it seems like to me of what's younger people are doing, what's happening in the culture. It's hard to make predictions, but just observations. Some of them are cliches. I do worry that, I don't know if students read as much in terms of books. They read everything on the internet, and they read short things here and there. I wonder about that. I do wonder about attention span. I do wonder about interpersonal relationships. It used to be I'd have lab sessions and students would come out of dark rooms and look at their print and everybody would be talking to each other and looking at each other's prints. Now they come out and they all look at their iPhone and they're all sitting there and nobody's talking. The face down generation thing, in just the last year I heard that term. And now it's like the New Yorker cover where the family's at the beach and they're all looking at their iPhones. It's startling to see. I don't know, but I don't know.
To answer your question about what I meant with branding, that branding is a way of commercializing a certain kind of outering that is going to take place. And,
You mean like new topographics?
Well, that's a different kind,
That's
but it was a kind of branding, yes,
Okay.
absolutely. So what I'm hoping is that whatever is going to emerge will have a chance, will have enough of a half-life for itself so that it can have enough density. And that aspect of it, I'm not certain of. There's Jeff?
Yeah, Steve, I'm exactly as old as you are, but I have a 15 and 17-year-old, two daughters, so it gives me the opportunity to experience, in a sense, what you're talking about at the dinner table.
Yeah.
But I have a thought, and listening to you about, the changes going on. If you look at the history of taking pictures, back in the beginning, it was an event. In the late 19th century, everybody gathered around and it was an event. What I think is happening is that it's becoming a non-event, and people are documenting non-events. And so when you apply that to poetry, it might be, analogous to maybe some of the free-form, 1960s type of poetry. But what's most interesting to me is how do we of our generation react to what people are doing today? Because this is how you become old.
We sound like a bunch of old fuddy-duddies up here. Yeah. A bunch of old fuddy-duddies up here.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is that, I'm not saying you're...
No, I know. I like what you said, event, non-event. I mean, that they're...
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just like what you said. It is like photography, when I started doing it, was an event, kind of. You got out of the car, not always, but you took the picture. Now it's much less kind of about, much less of an event. It's just a flow. I mean,
It's all about them and selfies.
It's all about what?
Right? Steve? You know what a selfie is?
Selfie.
A selfie.
A selfie. Here's your
oh,
phone.
yeah, I do, that's right.
Okay.
Okay, selfie.
I'm just checking.
Yeah.
We have to remain
Selfie.
current.
Right. Yeah, well, with my two sons, one's a filmmaker and the other's an architect. The filmmaker, he just got through making 2 or 3 movies using a drone, which you can see, Luke Fitch, Google it. They're amazing. He's into drones. And one of his movies just got this award and blah, blah, blah. My other son, the architect, he's into 3D modeling and 3D printing, which his architect firm, they print 3D models of the building. So here they are, 2 people that I think, 2 kids, the future is going to be drones, it's going to be a big deal, in 3D printing. So I'm kind of trying to grab onto their coattails just to have them stop for a minute and indulge me and explain, what's going on.
I just have one, I'm going to turn my statement around. What do you think, what do you think teenagers think of your work? Do they understand the context? Have you had any interactions with younger than maybe the students that you deal with? Do they find value in it?
The word cool comes up repeatedly.
I have had little experience with students recently, but mostly, oh, that's old. So, it's lack of interest, I would say, primarily. Oh, yeah, that was done. Let's move on.
I don't know, it's hard for me to say. My context mostly with college students when my kids are growing up. And yeah, they're interested in what I show it to them. I mean, maybe it's just because I'm their teacher and they need to flatter me. But they seem to be interested. Yeah. I show the work, and students, I show slides in classes. I bring in books. I'm showing.
You show slides?
I do. Well, some of them are digital slides, but I do. I made all these slides, and I'm not going to.
I'm going to throw mine
I still
out.
throw them.
There's
When I go, they're
$40,000
going.
that need
Jeff,
to be
how do you
done.
answer that question yourself?
Well, when my oldest daughter was in middle school, she took a history of rock and roll, and she came home and said to us, have you guys ever heard of AC/DC? It's like, what I see happening is, first of all, as somebody who is his age,
Who's he pointing at? Me? You?
Yeah, you.
Close
to the darkness.
I've been around long enough so that history is real to me. The bombing of Pearl Harbor is not real to me, but the 9/11 is very real, but not real to them. So I understand that there's a threshold where something is different. They've experienced something. And so what I try and do is I try and experience, at least think about how they're experiencing things and how I experience things and the differences. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we talk about different things.
I think students today are, from my experience, and we teach history of photography, and I show lots of work in my class, they're interested in history. And just the other day, one student really could see the connection of being aware of some pictures that were made in the 19th century, that it was relevant. So I think they're interested in history, I hope so.
That's good. Thank you very much.
That's great. On that note, we've gone way over time, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring the panel to an end. But thank you, audience, for being here, and thanks to the panelists for sharing your thoughts.